everyone, if you're in the lobby and
all right, we're up.
Is it working?
Yes.
Perfect, thank you.
Yep.
Okay, shall we go ahead and get started? Great. Well, welcome back everyone to our next keynote talk of the day. It is my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Dirk Bergemann to be our next speaker. Dirk is a professor of economics at Yale University. He has secondary appointments in computer science and finance. His research is in many areas, including game theory, contract theory, market design, more recently work in information design and data markets. Dr. Bergemann is a towering figure in economics and economic theory. He's built new research agendas in robust mechanism design, now in information design, and he is a very big source of inspiration for me and many other theorists in this area. So I'm so glad he can join us today in our launching of this conference and for the dialogue earlier today with Dr. Gray on data control and data markets. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Bergemann to speak about data, social data, and data governance.
Great, thank you, Irene, and I'm very happy to join this first opening conference of this new group at EAAMO on equity and access and algorithm. I think it's a great initiative, and so I'm very happy to be part of it. What I wanted to today is to talk and use you both in some ongoing research that I've been conducting with my colleagues on the value and the economics of data, in particular of social data. And then for this talk, draw some implications from that for the way we should govern data, how we should propose data governance as a public policy tool, and give you a little bit of an impression of where the current discussion on governance stands and how it relates to the academic and scientific insights and work that has been ongoing. Okay. Let me see what the great. So let's start out with data and data collection. As we're all too familiar, the rise of large internet platforms really led to an unprecedented collection of individual user data. We are all aware of Amazon and Facebook, Google in the US or in the West largely, but similar entities in Asia and China, in particular JD, Tencent, Alibaba, and in some sense even further ahead than what we experience in the US. These platforms, through a steadily increasing user base, generates really massive amounts of data about individual consumers. I apologize, I'm an economist, so I often think about individuals as consumers, but let's just talk about them as individuals. So we learn, or the platforms learn about their preference, locations, friends, political views, and of course, it's not just sort of adult individuals, but it's teenage individuals, as we just hear in the recent discussions surrounding Facebook. And to a large extent, this individual data allows companies to refine their products, to offer search results, offer personalized product recommendation, informative ratings, timely traffic data, all things that we quite enjoy and value. But at the core of these data collections from individuals is really the central aspect that I'm going to argue for today is its social dimension. Namely, when we capture, or when the digital platform captures data from an individual users, then not only does it tell us about something about this individual user, but it really is informative about all users similar to them. And thus, from the very beginning, we are facing a problem of how to deal with the social data. And it's precisely the social dimension of the data that is driving the value of the digital service. Okay? So think about shopping data as an example. An individual's purchase conveys information to a third party, say Amazon, about the willingness to pay for a given product, the demand level for a given product, essentially among all consumers with very similar purchase history or other observable and unobservable characteristic. And it's precisely the social nature of data that generates a significant, I would say, massive informational externality across the consumers, or sometimes referred to as a data externality. And today I want to suggest some of the main implications that follow from the presence of the data externality in the middle of the data economy. The social dimension of the data simultaneously leads to a loss of privacy, because I don't need to say too much to Facebook or to Google or to Amazon about myself for them to actually know quite a bit about me simply from people who are like me, okay? And while there's a loss of privacy, there's also gain in information. Clearly the prediction, say the search results that I'm going to get, are going to be informed by similar searches that people like me performed, okay? And what is new and what makes it so challenging is that if you think about this in externality, just in the regular economics term, the sign and the magnitude of this data externality, namely whether individual users experiences as a positive externality or as a negative externality, depends very much on the structure of the data. That is, what is sort of the network, the underlying network that we're trying to characterize, and also on the downstream use of this information. That is it used to basically create socially valuable matches, or maybe is it used to offer price discrimination and therefore just extract surplus from the consumers, okay? Independent of the sign, the presence of this data externality suggests that in the data economy, we are likely to often have inefficient market outcomes, okay? Because the externality simply will lead to socially inefficient allocation. And when we are concerned about the social aspect or the data externality, we should be aware that in fact, this externality may operate multiple times, or if you wish, at an extensive scale, because of course, the data is not just used for a single prediction, but is also used to inform all the algorithms that are being run. So really, the externality may operate multiple times at an extensive scale. For this audience that is of interdisciplinary character and comes from everywhere, let me suggest another externality, just to draw sort of a little bit of an analogy, and also to point out to the distinctions. Think about the most classic environmental externality, carbon emissions, okay? The sign of the externality that we suffer from a carbon emission by a producer is almost universal and clearly can be signed to be negative, okay? So that makes it easy for policy to think about what are the right tools and prescription to limit the externality. It doesn't make it easy necessarily to implement it, but regulatory restrictions could mean that we want to restrict the capacity. We want to restrict the number of carbon emitting factories or carbon emitting energy producers. There might be economic restrictions or economic tools that we can use, such as a carbon tax, to increase the private cost of generating and bring it closer to the true social cost of the use of carbon emissions, okay? This is much more difficult in the world of the data economy, because a priori, we know neither the sign nor do we know the level in some sense of the externality, okay? So what's the structure that I want to think about it? So it often helps to think about a concrete example, right? So if you think about users of search engine, think about users of social networks, the structure is essentially the same. There are consumers who are providing information to a data intermediary. Sometimes that information or the generation of information, the production of information is supported by payments or by services. But then a data intermediary is basically bundling all of this information and further selling it, say in a sponsored search auction or a digital advertising auction, to a producer who is using this information to tailor product, but also price between his product and the consumer. So there's going to be some surplus that is either reduced or increased through the use of the information. And that's the situation that I think we want to think about it. Now, easy examples here are, think about search. Okay, there clearly consumers are generating the search terms. Okay, they are compensated. We want to ask, is this the right level of compensation, perhaps by a service? And then it's monetized on the other side by the intermediary, here Google, by auctions that basically elicit a part of the surplus that the advertisers are willing to pay. This picture, this depiction, this diagram can of course look much more elaborate. So if you think sort of an entire supply chain of data going from consumers upwards to the apps, so that's the upstream market, the data market, that's being monetized by Facebook, and then being brought down to the firms that again are now permitted and allowed and have the ability to tailor their offerings to the consumers. Okay, these are all instances of where the data economy is interacting with the downstream economy, so that the real economy is where we are going to then exchange product and services. Okay. Three central questions that I think are relevant to get a grasp on how the data economy works is to say, how does the social dimension of data impact the terms of trade between consumers, data buyers, and the large digital platforms which for the moment enable that? Okay. What's the sense in which the social dimension of the data magnifies the value of the individual data and perhaps lowers the cost of data acquisition? Some colleagues at MIT, Daruna Samoglu and Arthur Ostergler, have related work that says too much data in the title, which basically says there's a sense in which the cost of acquiring the data is too low. And what I'm going to argue today is that that low cost is basically explained through the data externality. Okay. How does this relate if you now want to think not just about the data, but we want to think about the data governance to some fundamental flaws that we want to think about? Well, first of all, currently property rights for data are weakly defined, if at all. The value of data is rarely publicly disclosed. Okay, so think about how much we know about the price for matching advertisers and users as being realized through digital advertising auctions. Okay, this data is essentially unavailable, and it's only being realized at the digital platforms to whom it's proprietary data. This lack of pricing data is similar and similarly evasive in the entire world of health economics, where we find that there's huge inefficiency because consumers basically don't get any signals about the right decisions due to the lack of pricing data. Okay. Moreover, the lack of disclosure of any of this data that is emerging through these transactions in the ad tech stack, if it's sometimes called, would be very notable in other industries. So think about financial service industry, where fees by regulation need to be disclosed that brokers charge their clients. That is not at all the case in our current data economy. Okay. The lack of public price data also renders it very difficult for new companies or new institutions to emerge and to address data externality. On a very basic level, we don't even have good measurements of market power and market indices that would say how much data concentration is there. That is, can we make an argument for there being perhaps too much of a monopolistic strategy, because we don't know how much of the data flows, say through Facebook, say through Google. And so a very elementary insights and information that we need for public policies is currently simply not available. And so that limits, of course, our ability to guarantee access and fairness to data and the use of the data. Okay. Let me give you just one picture of that from a paper. I'm going to come to the references at the end that's entitled "The Economics of Social Data," that's just about to be published. What I want to take here is simply a two-dimensional pictures with basically on the right-hand side, this is on the x-axis, plots the correlation and the underlying preferences. Okay, so that's the preferences, and on the y-axis is giving you the correlation across users or individuals in terms of the noise or the experience that they're suffering. What we show in this paper is that what will be profitable data intermediation, which is the entire area in this two-dimensional diagram, is in green, fails to, in a reasonable sense, match which when there should be socially efficient data intermediation, which is all of the area to the right. Okay, which is to say, if you think about the lower left corner, there is often too much data acquisition. So there's being too much data acquired at too low a cost by the digital platform. That is when situations are such that we learn too much from one individual about the others. That is when the data externality operates such that it lowers the cost of data acquisition. Okay. If you think now on the northwest corner, where data intermediation is socially beneficial but doesn't happen in a marketplace, that's an area when we basically fail to trade on data, and that is when the aggregate data would allow us to essentially denoise the data and give individuals better predictions about their right choices and their right actions. So an example where I think this is descriptive is the health market, where for example, or the health environment in general, where during the time of COVID, we clearly realized that we didn't fully realize the benefits that could come from data intermediation in terms of alerting us to virus transmission, to all kinds of public health data that we should have generated, but the market certainly failed to generate that. Okay, and the public instruments were probably too weak. So this is to suggest that in the presence of the data externality, we can't expect the market necessarily to establish efficient outcomes and therefore socially efficient outcomes. And therefore, we want to think a little bit about the data governance that we're proposing for data and for social data. Okay. Let me sort of pause here for a second and relate it now to the current level of policy discourse. Right? We earlier in the morning, when we had the discussion with Mary, we already observed a surprising lack in public rules that govern the creation, exchange, and usage of private or individual data. Okay? To some extent, it's our fault as scientists, as economists, I can speak for them, but perhaps also for computer scientists, of not really pushing the dialogue and pushing the discourse further enough. But I think that has changed over the last few years, and it's a particular concern to civil society, for democracy, for underprivileged or for minorities that pushed us to think a little bit more about it, or think about addictive issues about in the use of social media as it came just about. Okay, and so this is a well-timed discussion, because there's both on the regulatory side, that is from the Justice Department, from the FTC, a large number of cases that basically tries to evaluate what the current position of the digital platform is. And then there's also, from the legislative point of view, quite a bit of action currently proposed in the US House that would give us, for the first time, a governance framework to think about the data economy. Okay. Let me perhaps, in view of the data externality, discuss 3 possible data governance solutions that would be following logically from the data externality. Okay. The loss of privacy is something that is of concern, and so one first, in some sense, layer to preserve privacy is to think about guaranteeing as a default a purely contextual regime to be operating at a lot of digital platforms or digital interaction. Okay, so just as you enter a store today and the prior assumption is there's no information collected about you, nor is there data collected about you, nor do you need to identify yourself. So should we basically insist that we can interact with the services of a company without any further identification or data collection. Okay, this clearly would elevate, in some sense, the bargaining position of the individual consumers vis-a-vis large digital platforms. In the presence of an externality, the typical answer of an economist is to think about internalizing the externality. How can we make it such that we are going to be able to internalize the externality so that it essentially disappears as a friction, as an impediment for socially efficient allocations. Okay. Finally, the loss of privacy has brought out a number of superb, more computer-inspired solution of preserving privacy by not shipping the data to the cloud or to a central platform, but rather to bring the algorithm to the data. So federated learning of cohorts, in situ rights that can be granted are so solutions that perhaps I just wanted to highlight. Good. Another one, let's go back to the environmental externality, could of course be just the standard taxation that simply raises the costs for data collection by the digital platform. And so that's one issue or one instrument that we should at least keep in mind. Okay. So let me talk a little bit about the contextual regime, right? We are basically used now that every interaction with the website immediately generates a lot of data and is being collected. A governance regime could simply say, as a default, every service has to be offered at a purely contextual level where no or minimal data collection arises. Okay, such uniform service without any segmentation across users and across their observable and unobservable characteristics would of course imply a much higher level of fairness in the allocation or equality in the allocation. Okay, and it would implicitly assert property rights to the individual data, namely, it is only after deliberation whether I want to enter into a different exchange level in some sense, that is data for service, that I'm granting the rights to access the data. Okay. This is quite different from what current policy suggestions, in particular the GDPR rules in Europe, which implicitly actually offers a choice of consumers between declining access to data but then having no service at all, or receive the service but then have immediately a loss of data property rights. So how we are choosing the default level, how we're choosing the outside option for the consumers really matters in terms of the property rights that we set. Okay. Internalizing the externality by creating a firm, a community, a cooperative, so it can be a profit or it can be non-profit entity, we might be able to basically collect individuals and have them represented by a much larger, if you wish, by a collective bargaining unit that helps internalizing the externality and redress some of the balance in the market. Okay? How realistic is that? Well, if you think about this, really collective bargaining already exists in this guise, okay? Apple receives large transfer payment for Google to place search engine on iOS devices, but really what at that point Apple is bargaining on behalf of, but not necessarily for, are the consumers and users that are collected on the iOS devices. Likewise, Google provides software at below cost to the margins, to the device makers, in exchange of data collection rights that are going to follow from them. Okay? That just shows you how powerful this idea of internalizing externalities, but of course, in the moment, it's done by the digital platform largely on behalf of themselves rather than on behalf of the consumers that they represent. Okay. So that leads us to think about, should there be not something like a data fiduciary? Okay. And a famous article, my colleague and law professor Jack Balkin at Yale asked the question, doctors and lawyers are prohibited from using clients' information for their own interests, so why aren't Google and Facebook? Okay, so they suggested that any intermediary that has as one of its purposes to collect the information should follow and should be subject to data fiduciary duties, like doctors and lawyers and even brokers are in other contexts. And so this is in fact something that's proposed in a current proposal that is in front of the New York legislation, and that goes much further than the California Consumer Privacy Act. Okay? This is just to show that these discussions are underway and that they are really meant to address this fundamental externality that we have identified earlier on in the talk. Okay. And here's it, of course, where a lot of ingenuity and engineering intelligence is required, and which is sort of a great open problem, I think, for computer scientists to work on, because what's the notion of information fiduciary? How can we make this work? How can we, guarantee security and control over personal data? And in fact, there are a number, perhaps Solid by Tim Berners-Lee, who is sort of developing a platform to link data applications that offer full control of personal data. Is one of them. Digime is another private sharing app. So I think there's going to be a lot of interesting development and relevant scientific thought about how we basically can rebalance and eliminate the externality that in the moment really hampers the digital economy. Okay, and I think with this, my time is over. Economists know that there are limits to collective bargaining that is relevant, and so there are clearly challenges in bringing intermediaries into this market, but the gains are quite large, and so I think we should think about it. I mentioned that the other notions that basically restore some of the privacy, some of them perhaps more self-serving than others, but it's definitely an area in which computer scientists, economists, and data scientists have lots to talk to each other and have lots to say to each other, and can help improve public policy outcome. Great.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dirk, for that really fascinating and thought-provoking talk. I really enjoyed this discussion of what can markets do and where do we need regulation, and some of the examples you provided. We're running a little bit over time, and so I think we won't have time for Q&A. So what I'm going to do is, Dirk, there's a question for you from Mary Gray in the Q&A. If you want to type the answer to that question, I think it's a fantastic question. So just reading it out for the rest of our audience. How does the analysis that Dirk provided change if the data tells us not only about users similar to us, but also about social relationships amongst groups of users? So Dirk, I'll let you type the answer in the Q&A there.
Yes, so it's a brilliant question, and it's actually a very challenging question because, in some sense, as soon as I establish a social relationship, there's a sense of similarity, right? And so then the question, who owns this? That is, if I would like to say, I want to move my data from Facebook to somebody else, do I have the rights to move not just my own data, but also my links to other people? I think these are very deep conceptual issues for network scientists, for computer scientists, for economists. So I think I would think of them as very related, and by definition, I think I would want to think about as relationship as being establishing similarity, connectedness, and that's sort of the key notion. I think that is very important.
Great, and that I hope is just the beginning of a discussion. Dirk, feel free if you have more thoughts to type them in.
And of course, you can reach me via email at dirk.bergemann@yale.edu.
Yes.
Thank you, Erin.
Thank you so much. So Dirk, if you don't mind stopping your share screen, we're going to transition now to our next session, which is very opportunely also on data, particularly on data standards and data sets. So I'll hand over to our session chair, Neil Gaikwad.
Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Dirk. So this is a great segue to our next session, data standards and data set. So please feel free to use Q&A controls for asking questions. And without further delay, I will introduce our first speaker, Frances Ding from UC Berkeley. And Frances will be presenting her work on facing an adult problem, new data sets for fair machine learning. Frances, would you share your screen?
Yes. Can you see my screen?
See your screen, and perfect.
Perfect. So, hi, thanks for having me here. Today, I'm going to be discussing this work about the UCI adult dataset, which is widely used in studies of algorithmic fairness, give some reasons why we might consider retiring it, and present some new datasets that we're very excited about and hope will be of use to the community. And this is joint work with Moritz Hart, John Miller, Ludwig Schmidt, and we're all at UC Berkeley. Okay, so why are we interested in datasets? The keynote already discussed a lot of reasons why. Datasets are also central to the machine learning ecosystem. And in today's machine learning paradigm, we split data into training and test sets and use the held out test sets to evaluate and compare methods. But that's not the only thing datasets do. So datasets also formulate problems by specifying an objective and a universe that we want to perform well on. They organize communities, for example, how the ImageNet Challenge became a central way to benchmark progress on computer vision. And datasets also interface between communities, such as academia and industry, giving them a common language for model inputs, outputs, and performance. Now, I also want to give a brief overview of fairness in machine learning and the role datasets play there. So the study of fairness in machine learning is a very active research area. And as a brief overview, many works take the framework that applying machine learning in the real world involves collection of a data set, which is then used to train a machine learning model, which can output often a decision that then affects the world in some way. At each of these steps, there may be bias or disparities between groups of people, and many works in algorithmic fairness study interventions to get each stage to satisfy mathematical fairness criteria, which are intended to also track normative goals, such as anti-discrimination. So as this diagram suggests, the field has recognized the huge importance of datasets and many of the harms that are associated with data, including historical biases, under or overrepresentation, and privacy concerns. So many of these concerns have been raised for cognitive tasks like vision or NLP and led to the creation of new datasets. However, when it comes to tabular data, most papers involve just a few datasets, and chief among them, UCI adult. So what is this adult dataset? It's part of the UCI data repository, and we can see on the list of most popular datasets from UCI, the first is IRIS, which is a really old and really small data set from almost 100 years ago with only 150 total data points. And the second most popular, adult, is our focus today and is also somewhat dated. So the adult data set has about 48,000 rows, each representing a US adult, where each row has that person's age, occupation, a couple of other characteristics, and whether or not that person's income was greater than $50,000 in 1994. Now let's do a deep dive into the adult data set, including its strengths and weaknesses. From its website in the UCI repository, we know that it was extracted by Barry Becker and Ronnie Kohavi from the, quote, 1994 census database. So this doesn't exactly pin down the source of the data, as we will discuss more later. The prediction task, as I mentioned, is to determine whether a person makes over $50,000 a year. And to do this prediction, there are 14 features available listed here. So I want to highlight in particular the race and sex features, which are examples of what the fairness community calls sensitive or protected attributes. And the presence of these features has contributed to the wide use of UCI adult in algorithmic fairness work. From Google Scholar, we assembled a rough estimate, really a lower bound on the number of algorithmic fairness papers citing the adult data set over time. And we see that as the fair ML literature has grown steadily over the past 5 years, so too have their citations of UCI adult. From our quick search, there are now over 300 fair ML papers that cite the adult dataset. So now I want to mention some of the good aspects of UCI adult. One good feature of the adult dataset is its origin in census data. So the Census Bureau has established survey and data collection standards, which arguably avoid some of the known issues with other ML datasets. First, the collection has a quality sampling frame that results in data that's actually representative of the United States. Second, surveyors are skilled and compensated, which is in contrast to some instances of crowdsourcing on Mechanical Turk and other platforms. And finally, the Census Bureau provides hundreds of pages of documentation detailing survey questions, how the survey responses were processed later, how they address privacy concerns, and so on. However, of course, there are also a number of issues with UCI Adult. So overall, we are concerned about UCI Adult's external validity. That is, how much we can expect conclusions drawn from UCI Adult to transfer to other settings. One apparent issue is that UCI Adult is over 25 years old. In 1994, Time magazine ran this cover about how new the internet was. And a lot has changed since then, including census encodings for race. For example, the category Asian Pacific Islander has been disaggregated, among other changes. Second, the adult dataset underutilizes the wealth of census data out there. Features such as state information are not included, and we will see that locality can be important to model. More subtly, the choice of $50,000 is worrying because it was and still is a high income cutoff, way above the median income in the US in 1994. In fact, it's the 76th percentile of individual income, the 88th percentile in the Black population, and the 89th percentile among women. What this means is that classifier accuracy is actually higher for individuals in minority groups, which is the opposite of one of the core concerns in fair machine learning, which severely calls into question UCI Adult's external validity for algorithmic fairness. So this leads us to ask the following questions. Can we reconstruct UCI Adult? And can we then create different versions of Adult with different income thresholds and test whether this affects fairness conclusions? I mentioned earlier that the documentation for Adult just mentions the 1994 census database. So to reconstruct it, we searched through different census data products. Although the Census Bureau is mostly known for the decennial census that aims to count every individual in the US, it also offers several high-quality data products, many of which are based on surveys sent out every year to a random sample of the population. These surveying efforts tend to have high response rates and collect much more detailed information compared to the decennial census. The data released publicly include aggregate statistics and tables, as well as microdata samples where each row represents a person. And this microdata is essential for creating an individual level data set. So now to our reconstruction of UCI Adult. We checked each row of UCI Adult against available census data, and we did find a match to the 1994 Current Population Survey Annual Social and Economic Supplement available at this link. We ran into some challenges finding these matches as attribute names were changed from the UCI Adult documentation. Some listings for the native country column were set to unknown in the adult dataset, and we also couldn't find exact matches for the final weight column. But this column seems to be not an individual characteristic, but a weight to get the overall dataset to match US demographics more precisely, and more details can also be found in our paper. So more importantly, with our reconstruction, we have access to the raw income variable now, which we make available as part of a larger Python package that I'll discuss more later. We created different versions of Adult with different income thresholds and found that the 50,000 threshold presents an incomplete picture of fairness conclusions. So here are the results for one of the most widely studied fairness metrics, demographic parity, which measures whether the probability of a positive prediction is equal across two groups. Here we're comparing men and women for the groups, and smaller violations are better. So ideally the violation would be at 0. We plot the most accurate standard model in blue, as well as 3 different methods to modify that model to enforce fairness according to demographic parity. We vary the income threshold from $0 to $70,000, and we see that the results are sensitive to the choice of threshold. With the original UCI Adult dataset, we would only see the slice of the plot at the dashed line and not the whole curve. So other results based on the adult dataset might also be sensitive to the choice of threshold, and we make our reconstructed dataset available for other investigations. As I mentioned earlier, though, the adult dataset only uses a fraction of the census data available publicly. For the last part of this talk, I'm going to discuss new datasets that we hope will be interesting for the community. So what do we want out of new datasets? First, it would be great to have just more datasets rather than primarily relying on a dataset like Adult. And we'd also like them to cover more types of prediction tasks. Second, we'd like to have test beds for whether methods transfer well between different settings, also called robustness to distribution shift. In particular, if methods don't transfer well, that's a big red flag for where and when it's appropriate to apply these methods to real-world decisions. We'd also like to have larger data sets with enough data to study intersectional groups that often get overlooked. So the good news is that the Census Bureau provides such a rich resource to create new data sets to get at these goals. And our work exposes more of these data products to ML benchmarking. We've released a Python package that wraps around census data at fulltables.org. And using the other features that the census provides, we've created 5 new prediction problems that run easily out of the box on predicting income, employment, health coverage, travel time to work, and mobility. Our package also makes it easy to create other prediction problems for any variables you might be interested in. And one thing we're really excited about is the fact that we can separate the data for all 50 states across multiple years, so it's perfect for studying performance variation in different settings and the effect of distribution shift. Now I'm going to briefly go through 2 of our interesting empirical findings with these data sets, but I want to emphasize that we're just scratching the surface, and we hope that these data sets will be useful to the community for lots of new insights. One observation we found is that training a classifier to enforce a statistical notion of fairness in one state and applying that classifier to another state leads to results that vary a lot depending on the state. So we generated this plot here by training a classifier on California data to enforce demographic parity, and then evaluated the classifier on all 50 US states. So each dot here represents one state. And what we see is that on California data, the classifier does what's expected, and it makes demographic parity violation 0 on the start point. But for other states, we can't necessarily expect that. Fairness violations spread far from 0, and accuracy is also unpredictable. As an aside, running these kinds of experiments is easy with our package. Here's a code snippet showing how to get California data that can be directly used for training a model, for example, logistic regression from sklearn. Another interesting finding was that fairness criteria violations may be more stable over time than predictive accuracy. Here we trained a standard model and 3 methods modifying it to enforce the demographic parity fairness metric on data from 2014. Then we evaluated the classifiers on 2014 through 2018 data. And what's well known is that classifier accuracy degrades with distribution shift, which here is changing the year that the data comes from. And we see gradual decreases in accuracy in this plot. What was surprising to us was that in contrast to that picture, violations of demographic parity were actually stable over time for all of the classifiers. So those are 2 empirical observations we found pretty interesting that hopefully give a taste for the kinds of questions we can ask with these data sets. Before I wrap up, I want to quickly talk about the scope and limitations of our work. First, we envisioned that this is primarily used as a benchmark data set to compare methods, but it doesn't replace other substantive investigations that rely on census data for data science in sociological, historical, economic, or other studies. Second, this is still US-centric data, and there's still a need in algorithmic fairness for data sets in international contexts. And on that note, we welcome contributions to folk tables, and some additions we'd love to see include international census data from the 102 countries represented in the IPUMS databases, which you can find at that link. So to conclude, today we discussed how the fairness community has recognized the importance of data sets, but the data and software ecosystem that the community relies on are still lagging. There's good news that the Census Bureau releases many data products that provide a rich resource for new data sets. And to make those resources available to the FAIR ML community, we've released a new software package that provides easy access to census data products and several ready-to-use data sets at folktables.org. From these data sets, we can see that distribution shift and inter-data set variation pose challenges for applying fair machine learning interventions to real-world decisions, and really echo the call for context-specific interventions and caution whenever trying to port one thing to another setting. Finally, we want to emphasize that there are many more questions to ask with these data sets, and we hope that it will be a useful resource to the community. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Francis. This is a great talk. We have one question, but I think we're almost out of time. So how about we take this offline and do it through chat? So our next speaker is Mohammed Ambia, and he will be talking about measuring data collection diligence for community healthcare. And I will be playing the video of the pre-recorded talk. Do you all see my screen? Perfect.
I am Ramesha Tanvasri from Singapore Management University. Hi, I am Ramesha Tanvasri from Singapore Management University, and our paper is titled Measuring Data Collection Diligence for Community Healthcare. We have partnered with Google Research and Kushi Baby, which is an NGO based in India. In the spirit of collaboration, the problem being solved here will be introduced by Rajit Nagar, the CEO of Kushi Baby.
Thank you, Ramesha. I'm Rajit Nagar, CEO of Kushi Baby. We provide digital health solutions to the Department of Health in Rajasthan, India. Since 2014, we have been working with auxiliary nurse midwives, known as EAAMO's, and other community health workers, building digital health solutions to empower their delivery of last mile healthcare. In the last mile setting, we have beneficiaries that have to walk through tough conditions in order to get to makeshift health camps. And we have health workers that are going through equally tough conditions and mostly tracking data on paper. And this scenario, unfortunately, does not allow us to glean insights from the important preventative care that is being delivered in these settings. This data is incredibly valuable. It's valuable for public policy decision-making at a state level. It's important for risk stratifying entire communities and even ensuring the longitudinal care of a given patient. But due to various different factors, whether it's lack of supervision, lack of human resources or training, and the improper incentive structures, the data quality that's being collected, even now on digital systems.
Neil, I'm really sorry. I think we might be hearing the audio just through your microphone rather than shared. Can we try it again? Because the quality is pretty bad for all of us.
Sure.
When you might have to stop share, and when you restart the share, there should be a little checkbox that says share audio down at the bottom. Let's try that one more time. Sorry about that.
All right, let me try it again.
Hi, I'm Ramesha Tanvasri
Is that better?
from Singapore Management University.
Not really. Can you mute your mic to see what we're hearing now? No, we're not hearing it all through the system now. I'm sorry.
Community healthcare. We have partnered with Google Research and Kushi Baby.
Let's try to reshare it one more time.
I think we were hearing it. It was just Neil that was not playing the video when you asked him to mute.
Let me reshare it again and let's try. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, make sure that box down at the bottom that says share audio is checked.
Collaboration, the problem being solved here will be introduced by Rajit Nagar, the CEO of Kushi Baby.
Thank you, Ramesha. I'm Rajit Nagar, CEO of Kushi Baby. We provide digital health solutions to the Department of Health in Rajasthan, India. Since 2014, we have been working with auxiliary nurse midwives, known as EAAMO's, and other community health workers, building digital health solutions to empower their delivery of last mile healthcare. In the last mile setting, we have beneficiaries that have to walk through tough conditions in order to get to makeshift health camps. And we have health workers that are going through equally tough conditions and mostly tracking data on paper. And this scenario, unfortunately, does not allow us to glean insights from the important preventative care that is being delivered in these settings. This data is incredibly valuable. It's valuable for public policy decision-making at a state level. It's important for risk stratifying entire communities and even ensuring the longitudinal care of a given patient. But due to various different factors, whether it's lack of supervision, lack of human resources or training, and the improper incentive structures, the data quality that's being collected, even now on digital systems, is far from ideal. And we are looking to improve upon that data quality because these challenges have prevented us from doing things like modeling out which mother is highest risk and what that effect could be on her future child. Ultimately, what we need a way to measure non-diligence in data collection. We need a way to predict what that non-diligence will be and explain in what ways the health worker is being non-diligent, so that way we can design targeted interventions. We have 15 community health monitors that have been supporting these health workers over the last 4 years. And we do have a general gestalt or idea of which health workers are good or bad. But with data, we can turn that conception into something far more specific and then therefore take data-driven engagements to improve data quality and ultimately health outcomes. To tell you how we're going about doing this, I'll pass it back over to Ramesha.
Thank you, Rajit. Let's have a look at our problem description. This can be divided into 3 problems. First is how to quantitatively measure non-diligence per ANM. Here, by non-diligence, we mean the poor data collection quality. The second problem is how to predict non-diligence per ANM to enable intervention. And the last problem is how to explain the behavior of ANM over time. Let me minimize my video since it's covering part of the presentation. There are a few challenges in this problem. The diligence of an ANM is not expected to be of the same quality over time, which brings in a temporal aspect to the problem. And we do not have any labels on who are the diligent and non-diligent ANMs in each time frame. Given the very hard unlabeled setting, we need domain expertise. Kushibaby provided us 11 rules designed by domain experts with years of experience. All these rules measure some percentages, and these rules were used with fixed thresholds in the past. For an example, the blood pressure rule measures the percentage of blood pressure readings by an ANM that are equal in a month. In this example with 5 patients, 80% of the readings are 120 by 80. When these rules are naively used with fixed thresholds, no ANM was tagged as non-diligent if they are used in N manner, and all the ANMs were tagged as non-diligent when they are used in O manner. We used a threefold approach in this study. The first is defining non-diligence behavior, and the second is defining non-diligence score and predicting the non-diligence score to rank the ANMs, and the third is cluster and generate interpretations. First, let's look at how to define non-diligence. We use all the data of ANMs in a time window of 1 month, and we process the rules using those data. Earlier, we explained the BP rule, and for all 66 ANMs, we have the percentages from the BP rule. Likewise, for each ANM, we have the percentages from all 11 rules, which gives an 11-dimensional vector. We call this as a percentage vector. We need to convert the non-diligence percentages to non-diligence probabilities. We get all the percentage vectors of all the NMs in all the months and plot the distribution of percentages for each of these 11 rules. For an example, this shows the distribution of BP rule percentages. Here 0 means good performance and 100 means bad performance. Suppose an ANM got 80% for the BP rule. To find the non-diligence probability, we can take the probability mass left of the 80 in this plot, which is 0.9. Likewise, we can get the non-diligence probabilities of all the ANMs for the BP rule. So for each ANM using the 11 rules, we get an 11-dimensional probability vector. We call this as the behavior vector. This gives a relative measure of the ANM's non-diligence with respect to the past performance of all ANMs in each rule. But this 11-dimensional behavior vector cannot be used to rank the ANMs. Therefore, in our second approach, we define a scalar non-diligence score using the Euclidean norm of the behavior vector. The ideal behavior vector for an ANM is the zero vector, meaning zero probability of non-diligence for every rule. Then we predict these scalar non-diligence scores using the ANM's past scalar scores in a linear regression predictor. We observe that given limited data size, linear regression outperforms other complex models such as neural networks and agrees more with the field monitors. The ranking enabled by these scalar scores will allow for intervention using limited resources in future. The figures show the distribution of true scores and predicted scores of the ANMs for 2 months in the test dataset. Given the real-world noisiness of the problem, this result was found to be acceptable by Cushy Baby. Now let's look into our third approach on how to cluster and generate interpretations. We cluster all percentage vectors obtained over all ANMs for every month, and we get 3 clusters. We convert these 3 cluster centers to non-diligence probabilities. We use this and the standard deviation of percentages to generate interpretations. We interpret the clusters in 3 varying information levels to match the different perceptive skills of the stakeholders. And this provides an idea about the type of non-diligence shown by the ANMs in hindsight. I will only describe the fine-grained interpretation in this presentation, and for coarse interpretation levels, please feel free to refer our paper. After clustering the percentage vectors, we get the non-diligence probabilities of the cluster centers. This shows us with respect to which rules the ANMs in each cluster is being non-diligent. However, some rules are important than others. For an example, for the BP rule, we observe more variance in the distribution of percentages. This means there is more room for improvement for some ANMs here. So we provide the interpretation for each cluster with respect to the important rules like BP rule. But for the rules where there is no significant difference in the performance for all ANMs over all the months, we do not provide any interpretations. However, we note down these rules for Cushy Baby to investigate. Note that we use the percentage vectors and not the behavior vectors because we want to measure the absolute performance of the ANMs and not the relative performance. Now we have described all 3 approaches, and then let's move on to the main highlight of our study, which is the field test. We validated our results using the observations made in a highly structured field monitoring exercise carried out by Cushy Baby in Rajasthan. The field monitors worked with randomly chosen ANMs for 1 week each, and the whole exercise was carried out for 4 weeks. The monitors were provided a list of questions relating to the ANM's performance, and Cushy Baby inferred whether an ANM is diligent in a week based on the answer to this questioning, which is what we compare with the output of our AI system. We observed 84% correct non-diligence detection by our system, where 67% of our AI predictions matched with the monitor's observations, And in the remaining 17%, our system correctly identified non-diligence, which the monitors missed out. As ethical considerations, we use the word non-diligence to emphasize this is not a deliberate manipulation of data by the ANMs. And we sought regular feedback from the field monitors throughout our project. The targeted intervention based on our system's results will be non-punitive. Many of the data quality related approaches in the literature focus on scenarios where the noise or corruption is an outlier. But poor quality data is not an anomaly in our problem. In fact, majority of the data is poor quality due to the non-diligence in collecting data. We tried a popular variational autoencoder-based anomaly detector, and the percentage of ANMs tagged as non-diligent is around 10 to 12%, which is considered as too small by Cushy Baby. To summarize, our final product has been through many iterations before the success in this final system, where we learned many lessons from our experience, and I will list down few here. It is important to get constant feedback from the ground throughout the project. Our initial product had the binary output of diligent or non-diligent, but the field team required a fine-grained score, and now we provide that. Also, our system had 3 additional rules which capture records of health tests which are done at the main health centers only. After an ethical review, it was decided that these rules do not capture the ANM's diligence. Second lesson is that the black box interpretations, that is explaining by providing quantitative weights of the rules, were not useful for the Cushy Baby's field team in our case. Hence, now we provide fine-grained cluster interpretations, which is much more preferred by the field team. For real-world applications, it is important to use techniques that are relevant for the problem. Initially, we used the LSTM network and fuzzy clustering. And although the system had high accuracy, this was not convincing or interpretable for the field monitors. Last but not the least, when solving a real-world problem, we have to be ready for the environment to change. So we have a flexible system where rules can be modified, added, or removed easily. Finally, we are currently developing stillbirth and low birth rate predictors using diligence scores as an indicator of the data quality. This data quality problem can be observed in all the states of India. And we hope to apply this technique to other areas of India as our NGO partner Cushy Baby expands their operations. Thank you for listening to the presentation. And if you have any questions, please feel free to email us. Thank you.
So that was a great talk from Ramesha and Mohammed. I don't see any questions popping up for that talk, but if there are any questions, feel free to ask in the chat or engage with authors on the given email. So our next speaker is Joy Su from Stanford University, and Joy is presenting her work on open data standard and analysis framework towards response equity in local governments. And this is joint work with the city of San Jose. Joy?
Cool. Let me share my screen, and also my co-author Ramya is also here from DataKind on the screen. All right, this screen is viewable, yes? Cool. So I'm Joy. I am a CS PhD student at Stanford, and I'm here today with Ramya, Edwin, and Christine, and we're presenting on open data standard and analysis framework towards response equity in local governments. And this work, as mentioned, is really done with collaboration with DataKind, a nonprofit that works on social good applications, as well as the San Jose Mayor's Office of Tech and Innovation and the city of San Jose itself. So to give a brief intro, I want to talk about San Jose. So San Jose is an incredible city. It is the 10th largest city in the US and the capital of Silicon Valley as we know it. We're incredibly culturally diverse. English isn't the primary language in 57% of households. But in recent years, inequitable growth have really exacerbated issues like the digital divide. And so here's where we come in. So we are the San Jose's Mayor's Office of Technology and Innovation, and we really work to democratize the economic benefits of technology. And our goal is to research ways to use the city's open data ethically and in ways that drive equitable outcomes for constituents. So a bit more about open data. Studies have shown that there's a lot of gaps in current open data usability. For instance, data can be inconsistent in different formats, at different available fields and encodings, and linking data sets that would provide additional needed context. That's very difficult. And the impact of that is that city officials and researchers and citizens alike have a lot of difficulty in navigating open data flows. Similarly, running these analyses on existing data requires a lot of specialized technical expertise, and many open data sets lack public analyses. And the impact of that is that users don't fully engage with or understand the data that's been collected. And the open data benefits of transparency and accountability and better policymaking are vastly undermined. So really looking at the pain points in the current workflow of open data inspires to rethink a new framework. We want to introduce a framework that allows us to iterate very quickly with external parties and as well as internal departments, as well as just create a better workflow that people can actually use open data and better yet understand what the equity and different measures we can take from it. And so here I'll pass on to Ramya to talk a bit about related work.
Thank you, Joy. So to inform our work, we conducted a review of available relevant literature. So first, we reviewed open data tools in cities, both internationally and within the US, with some key findings highlighted here. Within the US, we see that more data mature cities, such as San Francisco and New York City, have data standards of various scopes that have been created to guide open data portal users. Other more data mature US cities have dedicated resources that support and conduct equity-focused work using open data, like in the city of San Jose. Of note, we highlight Long Beach, Austin, and Chattanooga here. And all of these demonstrate concrete steps taken by local governments to highlight inequity in government service provision. However, this literature review highlights an opportunity for the development of tools that help reduce technical barriers of equity-focused analyses for other parties, such as city residents themselves. We then came to understand that of all common open local government data sets, those focused on emergency response were highly relevant and available across cities. Existing studies have highlighted some of the work in this space, but this was an area that the city of San Jose has not focused too much on in the past. Therefore, our three-part framework is meant to expand the scope of analyses that interested parties can conduct, which Joy will now dive into.
So we really propose a three-part framework to tackle this problem. So the first is a US census-linked API. The second is centralized equity analyses. And the third is an open data standard. So that in our US census-linked API, we create an interface that augments government data sets with information from the US Census. Essentially, we're mapping location attributes, whether in zip code or lat long, to census tracts. And in doing so, we can supplement data with a lot of metadata, such as median age and schooling, gender, race, household income, etc. And this really helps us identify communities that local departments have historically underserved. And after we've augmented our data, we create a centralized equity analyses to quantitatively measure government resource and service allocation. So we're trying to compare the quality of government resources for different groups, but quality of resources is really defined differently for every government data set. It can be access, speed of access to a certain service, or the quality of resources, etc. And so we create a platform that allows users to define their own quality of resource metric. And so an example of that can include response time for emergency responses in local governments. And so after we define this quality of resource metric, we can then test for statistically significant differences provided across different groups. And we can thus report fairness across democratic factors such as race and ethnicity and income. And we provide summary statistics and correlation between demographic measures and quality of government service. We then proposed an open data standard as current public data sets, especially in government, lack guidance and consistency across data set fields and metadata. So we want to define standardized fields with focus on encoding geospatial location as well as census linked data. And some of our key design considerations, including clarity. So is this data presented in a format that is in a simple and human readable format? And two, is this standard lightweight? Would it be easy for city departments like San Jose to adapt their current processes and to follow the identified practices? And so we really want to create a standard such that data sets must capture the minimal amount of information needed to keep fields from containing duplicate information in really obscure formats. Next, I'll pass on back to Ramya to talk about our results.
So our contribution to this body of work is really with the introduction of our technical component and data augmentation piece that Joy mentioned. So given the gaps in analysis that we identified through our literature review, we demonstrate this framework on San Jose fire response data from 2020. We focus specifically on high priority medical incidents to which the fire department responded. So note that this framework does generalize to other response related data sets from San Jose, as well as fire response data from other cities like Detroit. Our workflow first features basic data cleaning and the generation of basic health metrics to evaluate data quality. Acknowledging and accounting for data quality issues can be another barrier for open data usage. So the metrics screened by our framework provide a more accessible starting point. We then showcase the potential for a US Census linked interface, which augments the original publicly available data with publicly available demographic information. This provides the necessary fields to enable any kind of equity-focused analysis. We then derive the basic data standard that, when followed, can help reduce another technical barrier to conducting analyses on open government data. Next, we enable rigorous statistical testing on local government response times by different demographic communities based on income, race, ethnicity, etc. And finally, this is then supported by the automatic generation of interactive visualizations. So understanding the data both in a statistical sense and more visually helps us more clearly identify areas to advance more equitable government resource allocation and policymaking.
So our framework is really created to reduce technical barriers to running equity analyses. The visualizations that Raman just showed allows citizens and constituents and internal departments to actually see the data and visualize it in a very clear way. So we want to provide a framework for cities that want to enable access to standardized data. And in doing so, we can very easily identify areas of opportunity to support equitable access for underserved communities. And in our presentation paper, we really focus on emergency service data, but our work is generalizable to any of the data sets in local government work. And there's a lot of really cool insights that can drive equitable policymaking. So some other things we can look at include proximity to key resources such as schools and hospitals, water quality, and school funding allocation. But of course, there's also limitations to our work. There's a need for ongoing maintenance and support for our framework, which would be hard for local government. And also there could be unintended consequences that stem from an open source ability to automatically include demographic factors for any given data set. In addition, our system may be subject to misinterpretation and misuse. So our goal is to continue to iterate on this work by working with external interest group, constituents, and internal parties to prevent this from happening. And we're really interested in incorporating data insights in the policymaking process in the city by direct engagement with decision makers. So for instance, we had very lengthy chats with the San Jose Fire Department to figure out what are the next steps we can take away from our equity analyses. And our goal is to really expand our system to multiple cities across the US by working with peer cities like Long Beach and San Francisco and basically all across our current system.
So in conclusion, our work proposes a framework to reduce technical barriers to running equity analyses on open local government data. We demonstrate its potential capabilities, showcasing how it may support data-driven, actionable policy recommendations to then inform equitable resource allocation in cities. As a next step, we will soon be launching this work on a public website. But with that, I'm happy to take any questions offline. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Joy, for a great presentation. Thank you, Ramya. So this concludes our session on datasets standards. For the next session, we will be starting at 3:30 EST. I don't see any questions that are emerging. So So feel free to hang around and either in the gather space or here, if you have questions, you can still ask to our speakers, and we'll resume our next session at 3:30. And it will be about law and politics.
All right, I see more people are trickling in from Gather. I have just announced that we're starting on Gather, so we'll give it just a bit less than a minute and we'll start. Yeah.
Sounds good.
Let me know when I should share my screen.
You can go for it.
Okay.
All right, I think we can get started.
Okay.
The next chair will be Sam Taggart, who will be chairing the session on law and politics.
All right. Welcome, everyone. So today's first speaker will be Chika Okafor. And as Chika speaks, if you have questions, you can leave them in the Q&A section. There will be 1 minute or so for questions after the talk. The title of Chika's talk is Prosecutor Politics, the Impact of Election Cycles on Criminal Sentencing in the Era of Rising Incarceration. Chika, go for it.
Thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Chika Okafor, and I'm an economics PhD candidate at Harvard and a JD graduate of Yale Law School. So I want to start off by grounding us on some very basic facts. First, as we can see, there was a very rapid increase in the number of incarcerated individuals in the US, which began around 1980. Also, there is this quote from a former Supreme Court justice that holds that the prosecutor has more control over life, liberty, and reputation than any other person in America. This introduces a very basic question on the relationship